Hi, my name's Andrew Hale and I'm a certified animal behaviourist that works with Pet Remedy. In this short presentation, we're going to look at your animal's experience, your animal's emotional experience. We're going to be referencing dogs mainly, but the same applies to any companion animal. And then we're going to think about how Pet Remedy can help in that dog's emotional experience and why it's an important tool in our toolkit when supporting dogs with sensitivities. Right, let's get on. Great. Okay, so as I was just saying, we're going to be looking at we're looking at dogs specifically in this presentation, but it does apply to cats and rabbits and other species as well. But we're going to look at dogs specifically, and we're going to look at challenging some of our norms about how we might perceive an animal's behaviour. And we're going to recognise the emotional drive to that behaviour as we go through. So I'm just going to go through things little bit by little bit. So as I say, my name's Andrew. I'm a certified animal behaviourist, and I'm also the behaviourist for a local rescue called Animals in Distress. I'm also a trustee with the Association of Interdogs, and I'm also co-chair for the International Companion Animal Network. I want to say a big thank you to a couple of people before we start. So the first is Dr. Kathy Murphy. Now, Kathy is a well-known vet and also a neuroscientist, and she is really pushing forward with a lot of the information and education around the neurology of dogs and looking at how their brains process information. We're going to be touching on that a little bit today. And she has a great Facebook page called Barking Brains. So if you are on Facebook, search out Barking Brains and you can get loads of great information that Kathy puts out there. It's great to work in collaboration with people like Kathy because she has all the geeky neuroscience, which really helps us as kind of jobbing behaviorists to be able to make sure that we're right at the cutting edge of the latest science. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. And also Sarah Fisher. Now, Sarah is amazing. She's based up in Bath. Sarah is a big pioneer of ACE. So ACE is animal-centered education. And Sarah's bias is on the nervous system. We're going to be looking at both of these things today. Looking at the nervous system, looking at how dogs move, looking at the relevance of pain in behavior, and trying to promote us looking at animals in a more holistic way. Again, Sarah has a Facebook page, which is ACE Connections, and I would highly recommend people to join that group, especially if you have an animal, dog specifically, I'm talking about today, that struggles and that has some challenges. So I just want to give a big thank you to these people. It's really important that we collaborate in the industry, and at Pet Remedy especially, we really focus on collaboration so that we can get the very best outcomes for the animals that we support. Okay, so this is Milo, one of my dogs. He's not with us anymore, sadly, but any excuse to put up a picture of Milo, that's good. I'm going to be using a lot of human examples today, and there's always the risk of people thinking that that's anthropomorphizing or humanizing. But hopefully, as we go through this presentation, you'll realize that actually it isn't that too big a leap to step into our dog's emotional experience because we share a lot as fellow mammals. So a lot of the referencing, I will use some human examples, but the neurology and the physiology is very similar for dogs, and that's what we're going to be looking at a bit today. So I will be using some human examples because we're all humans, right? Listening to this. Good. Okay, so let's just start off with what is kind of the problem. Now, we as a species, as humans, we're very good at wanting to judge behavior. We want to put behavior on a continuum of good to bad, which is okay for us as a societal species. We have the rule of law, we have social cohesion, but it isn't necessarily a reflection upon that animal's experience, on that dog's experience. And when we think about a lot of the words that we use, dominant, naughty, bad, all we're doing there is making the behavior the issue. And as I hope to show in this presentation, we have to move away from that. We have to think about behavior in a different way. And this is why. All behavior, including our own, so I've got a human psychology background before I came to animals, and it's the same principle. All behavior is emotionally driven. So it's emotionally driven and consequence-led. So what that means is we very much do things, our dogs do things based on how we feel. And what the outcome of that behavior is used for next time to feed into what we might do next time, and that's the consequence bit. Traditionally, with animals, dogs specifically, there has been a big emphasis on the consequence bit. So we've decided that the behavior is wrong or bad or whatever we've decided, or inappropriate. So what must the consequences be for that behavior? Punitively or positively even, we focus on that. What I really want to try and show today is that we need to start thinking just as much about the emotional drive side of things. In other words, what triggered the dog to do that in the first place? So I'm going to use a good human example here for us to start off with, because it's good for us to kind of think about this in these terms. Now, I'm going to use the snake analogy. The reason we use the snake analogy is because most people can recognize what it's like to be near a snake if you don't like snakes. Now, I recognize that some of you listening to this might not like snakes. So I don't want to be triggering people. So hopefully when you meet Samantha, the snake, you won't be triggered by her. So here she is, Samantha the snake. And as I said, I didn't want to use a real picture of a snake just in case it triggers somebody. But we all know, we all have a snake. So for me, it's about heights. I really struggle with heights. Some people, it could be spiders, it could be mice, it could be anything, all sorts of different things that can trigger us. But I'm going to use the snake analogy here because it's a good one. So let's just say that I've got somebody called Mary, and Mary doesn't like snakes. If I put a snake near Mary, or if a snake comes near Mary, she will have a pretty instant neurological, which is the brain, and physiological, which is the body, response to that. In other words, she gets stressed. That in turn would trigger her behavior. So that could be screaming, shouting, kicking out, trying to get away, whatever it is that Mary does in that situation. Now, if I, Andrew, as the calm bystander, have decided that it's Mary's behavior that's the problem, so I've decided that, then we have to recognize that is my narrative, that is my view. It is not Mary's experience. So if I've decided that the behavior is the problem alone, that's the problem. I don't like Mary's behavior. I find it inappropriate. I find it naughty. I find it bad. All these kind of things that we label behavior for. I only have two options. I either treat Mary punitively, and this is sadly what happens a lot with dogs still. And that is where I might tell her off. I might try and correct her because the behavior is wrong and I've got to correct it. Or I might even punish her. Now, the thing is here, if I was to do any of those things, I might be able to change Mary's behavior. I might be able to shift it. But importantly, I haven't changed how Mary feels about the snake. I haven't addressed that. And even more importantly, I didn't listen to what Mary was trying to communicate through her behavior. Also, this is another important consideration. So yeah, I was going to say there's two approaches there, punitive, or we could use positive reinforcement. That's the other option. We can use positive reinforcement to help Mary to give a different behavior. But if I'm only looking at changing behavior, that's the only thing I'm thinking about, is that I've decided Mary's behavior is not right. I need to change Mary's behavior. If I'm only looking at behavior, there is a risk, a big risk, with positive reinforcement as well, that I end up getting a behavior that I find more appropriate, but still hasn't addressed the issue, that still doesn't make Mary feel any differently about the snake. So this is the risk of judging behavior and just having strategies to change behavior. Because at some point, if I was to be a bit more empathetic with Mary, I need to step back and think, right, if the behavior isn't the problem, what is? And actually it's about Mary's emotional state. So if I really want to help Mary, if I want to make it about Mary, I need to do a couple of things. I need to, one, listen to what that behavior was communicating. She's stressed, right? Try and identify what the stressor is. Okay, it's the snake, great. So now then, I have a clearer picture. Now I recognize that her behavior isn't the problem, it is the symptom of the problem. The snake itself isn't a problem per se, because another person might not have that reaction around dear old Samantha, who's just wiggling by, minding her own business. The problem is how Mary feels about the snake. So when we recognize this, this is about stepping into the other person, in this case, or animal or dog's experience, trying to step into their experience. Important little point here. I couldn't fully step into Mary's experience, like I couldn't fully step into anybody listening's fully their experience, because we all process things differently. But we can empathize and we can have an idea, yeah, obviously Mary is struggling around the snake. So when we think about that, then we actually have two options again when we start thinking about the emotional response as opposed to the behavior. And the two options are, first of all, management. Keep Mary away from snakes. Now, that seems pretty obvious, and a lot of people see management as a bit of a cop-out. But actually, it's completely valid. If you had a family member who was a bit shy, a bit socially anxious, you would avoid town on a Saturday afternoon because it's too busy for them. That's just being a good carer, being a good friend. You just try to avoid the things that are going to stress us. I try and avoid heights because they stress me out. So I try and avoid them, and those around me know that. So they would not ask me to go up the ladders to clear their guttering for them because I can't deal with it. So management is really good and it's really valid. So when we think about our dogs then, when they're struggling in certain situations, remember they're communicating through the barking, lunging, growling, that they're struggling in that situation. Can we actually avoid those situations? Can we do something so that the dog doesn't have to have that emotional response? The second option we have is to change the way Mary feels about snakes. And this is really important because, again, if you imagine a dog who maybe might, and this might be your dog, lunges and barks when it sees another dog. Traditionally, it's still the norm, sadly, but traditionally, the behavior would be seen as the problem. We've got to change that behavior. Now we can think, actually, it's about how Rover feels about seeing the other dog that's the issue. That's triggering a response in him, which creates the barking and lunging. We either need to keep him away from that situation, or over time, following a process, working with a suitable professional, we need to think about changing how he feels when he sees the other dog. So this is the big thing that we're trying to put across in this presentation, really, is it's trying to recognize the animal's experience more and try and shift away from just judging and defining the behavior as the issue. So when we think about the emotional load then, is what that is about. So with Mary and the snake, big emotional load there. If we just focus on changing behavior, we risk not being able to provide any relief. We're going to come on to relief in a little while because it's an important principle, to the emotional load that triggered it in the first place. And this is the case whether we use punitive or positive means. It's really important to remember that. Obviously, we use positive reinforcement. It's really important, but it's better to try and reinforce behaviors that are going to be of use. So to reinforce behaviors for Mary that would be of use to her in those times of stress, not just behaviors that we find more appropriate. There has to be an element of relief involved for the animal. So when we think about then the emotional functions of behavior, there are two. And we know this from Mary and the snake. The first is to communicate an emotional response, and that's why we have the behavior. So it communicates out there to others. So Mary's very much telling us actively or passively, I'm going to come on to that in a moment, that she's struggling. So behavior, we have to start seeing behavior as communicative, especially in animals. When we think about our dogs, the only way they can communicate emotional need, the only way they can communicate emotional state is through their behavior. They can't write it down and leave us a note or tell us. They can only tell us through their behavior. So it communicates an emotional response. Go look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. And to help relieve or support that emotional response. This is really important. When Mary's there around the snake, what she really wants is to get away from the snake, or the snake to get away from her. She needs relief from that feeling. We all know what it feels like. We need relief at times, but also to support that emotional response. And that's for positive emotional responses. So if you've just won £1 million on the lottery, then you're going to feel amazing, right? That's going to be amazing. So you're going to be like, I need to support this emotional response, this feeling. I like this feeling. I need to feel it more. So we would do things, and we all pursue things that we enjoy, and that's what we like to do. And that's what supports those positive emotional responses. Sorry, I just had a drawer fall on the floor there. Yeah, these two things are very important. So let's just look at the first one, behavioral communication, the communication of behavior. There are two types. There is passive communication, and that is where the dog or the animal isn't directing it deliberately. It is just showing it us. So if we imagine a dog then who hides under the table, who cowers away, they are showing us passively their emotional state. They are not directing it deliberately at us. They're showing it passively. And the other, as you can see here, is actively. It's interesting for me that if a dog is cowering, shaking, lower body carriage, hiding away, that invariably gets sympathy, as it should. But if the same dog, when somebody goes near it now, dares to show its teeth or growl or even air snap or go to bite, then suddenly all bets are off, because now apparently the dog's being dominant, or the dog's being this, the dog's being that. The dominance model, by the way, is a bit of a fallacy. That's something for another talk. But we have to think about it. But it's the same dog. The dog has now using just a different behavior, using an active communication. It is deliberate now. It is deliberately communicating to us. So we have to recognize this. It's very important that we recognize the importance of behavioral communication. Now, we might not like it sometimes, and I do recognize, of course, legal considerations here. Biting will get the dog into trouble legally, and we totally get that. That's why it's really important to make sure that we understand what's going on for the dog and manage that, so that the dog doesn't have to use their mouth. But and I also get that it can be very upsetting. We had a dog who passed away recently, sadly, but when he came to us, we only had him for a short amount of time, because he was quite an old boy when he came to us anyway. But he was a grumpy old spaniel, and he bit us a couple of times, especially when he first came, because we didn't know anything about him, and he didn't bother with any kind of build-up. He just thought, right, I just bit us. Part of me felt, wow, I'm really upset by that, because I'm trying to save your life here. I'm trying to help you out. But I had to park that, my own emotional response. I had to park that a little bit and think, right, didn't like it, it hurt, but you are very clearly communicating something to me here, and I need to work that out. I need to work that out if I'm going to help you. It's very easy to respond back. And this is what tends to happen when with certain TV shows, I won't mention them, but they're all about challenging dogs and their behavior. So if the dog growls, well, you can't have that. You've got to pin them down. You've got to prod them in the side. You've got to yank the leash. All we're telling dogs when we do that, is all we're saying to them is, I don't care how you feel. I don't care what you're trying to communicate. I just want you to stop. Using Mary and the snake again, if I just challenge her for a behavior, I'm telling her, just shut up, Mary. I don't want to know. I don't care how you're feeling. I just want you to stop, because I've decided you must stop. So these are important principles for us to kind of get our heads around and to start thinking about animal behavior, dog behavior specifically, in a different way. So if we're going to do this, then we need to step into the animal's experience. And how do we do that? We just need to recognize two very important principles, two very important structures that apply to us and dogs. So it's the same, exactly the same. The first is processing. We have a brain to do two things. One is to take on information through something called sensory integration. So our senses are there so that it can feed information to the brain. So the brain can process that. The other role of the brain is to help us to regulate our behavior, to self-regulate, to moderate our behavior. So despite those feelings we might get, those urges, those drives, we can have some kind of chance at being able to moderate that. Processing is really important. The same applies to dogs as applies to us. They need to be able to process stuff that's going on around them, and they need to ideally do that in a calm, safe way. things go wrong when they can't process things fully. We're going to come on to processing in a bit more detail in a mo. And the other is about the nervous system. Everything's about the nervous system, really. So the nervous system is what makes us kind of do stuff and makes us feel stuff, along with the brain. The nervous system can get direction from the brain, and the nervous system can do things on its own. Invariably, when we get ourselves into trouble, that's our nervous system. When we lose our temper with a loved one and we have a bit of fruity language, or we slam a door, or whatever it is we do in the moment, that's our nervous system. It just takes over a little bit. So let's look at these two in a little bit more detail, because they're really important when we start thinking about our animal's experience. Processing. I use this analogy for processing. If you imagine your dog's brain has lots of little doors in it, we need as many doors to stay open for the dog to be able to safely and calmly and rationally process what's going on. The problem here is pain, big one, pain. This is why we always try and get vet checks done for animals that are struggling behaviourally, because there could be a pain element. Pain, stress, especially pressure that comes along from social pressure, social engagement, that kind of thing. These things are big door closers. So if we think back to dear old Mary with the snake, she's got no doors open. She's not processing anything. Even if I said to her, what's 2 + 2, she probably couldn't answer it, because the more stressed we are, the less we can process. So when we think about our dogs then, and that when they're already stressed, remember, excitement is stress. It's very important to put that in. Any type of level of over arousal is classed as stress, and that can be just because the dog's really excitable. We're then barking orders at these dogs. We're expecting them to do as they're told. We're expecting the training that we put in to work. The reason it doesn't sometimes is because they just haven't got enough doors open. They can't process it. They can't process what it is you're asking of them. And in fact, often when dogs are in these stressful states, us trying to put more training in or to put more pressure in is just closing even more doors, because they can't even process what they're dealing with, let alone the extra stuff that we ask. And this is why training can fail sometimes. You know, I'm very lucky. I live on a beach here, and when the dogs are on the beach, whether they've had good training or minimal training, the reality is the beach is a highly distracting, highly arousing environment for many dogs. And then people wonder why the recall might fail, or why the dog doesn't listen. And then the problem here is we go back to labels again, what we were talking about at the beginning. When the dog doesn't do as they're told, they're willful, they're disobedient, they're ignorant. Are they now? Question mark. Actually, I think it's more a case that they just haven't got enough doors open. And they just can't process stuff. So processing is really important. So this is one analogy that I give to my clients a lot, that when we start working with an animal moving forwards, let's say talking about dogs specifically, are we opening doors or are we closing them? Is that dog in the right processing state to actually make sense of what we're trying to do? When you're trying to expose the dog to a trigger that might be quite stressful, we've got to try and make sure that those doors are staying open so they can learn what we're trying to give them information-wise around being safe and supporting coping strategies. It's no good if all those doors have closed already, because they're just not going to process anything. They're not going to take anything in. The other thing we talked about is nervous system. Now, some of you may be aware of this analogy already, and it's a really good one. It's not my own, it's one that is used widely. And that is the bucket analogy. So if you imagine an empty bucket denotes the nervous system or the stress system. And the water in the bucket is the amount that nervous system's engaged, or how much stress the animal is holding, that emotional load that we were talking about earlier. When we go back and think about Mary, when that snake's there, her bucket's pretty full. In fact, her bucket's probably very full, might even be overflowing. The trouble is, the fuller the bucket, the less doors that are open, the less chance of a mindful, rational, self-regulated behavior, more chances of a irrational, emotional, and potentially reflexive behavior. That word reflexive is very important. When we lose our temper with a loved one, we're having a bit of an argument at home, and we have a bit of fruity language and we slam the door, that's reflexive. It happens in the moment. We don't think about it. We can all do and say things in the moment, in the heat of the moment, as we say, that we might, when we're calmer, when our bucket isn't so full, we might apologize for later. It's no different for our dogs. They have the same nervous system setup as us. The autonomic system is the bit that regulates this bucket. The bucket filling is the sympathetic, the bucket draining is the parasympathetic. And it's really important for some of our dogs, their bucket's pretty full most of the time anyway, before we even think so. Some of the dogs I go to see who might have a problem with seeing other dogs, for example, they've already got generalized anxiety. Their bucket's already pretty full. They're already trying to deal with a lot of things, especially some dogs who have been through a trauma, who are struggling with things in the home environment. That nervous system never fully gets a break. So when we pull this together a little bit then, it's really important that we recognize that when we see our dogs, and we're talking dogs specifically here, act in a certain way, we might not like it, and that's fair enough, and we might think it's inappropriate, that's fair enough as well. But at some point, we do have to step back and think, right, what is the animal's experience? What is it that's filling this dog's bucket? Am I helping this dog to open doors and drain the bucket? Or, without meaning to, am I adding to the bucket? Am I closing doors? The most important thing is to recognize that if we use terms like naughty dog, bad dog, we have to recognize that is our narrative. It is not the dog's experience. There is no deliberate intent from that dog to give us a hard time. They're just letting us know that they're struggling. So this brings us on to a really important principle then, which is the principle of relief. Now, when we already learned about how the nervous system engages and fills the bucket, and as soon as we start to have that feeling, that kind of sensation, we need to feel a different way, and that's a process called homeostasis, which brings us back down again and gets us back to that normal baseline level. So we all know what it's like to feel that we need some relief. You know, we could be very tired and we need to have some sleep, and we could be in pain, big one, pain. And especially this is one thing we have to identify with the dogs and with the animals, is to make sure that they're not in pain, because they really need some relief from that pain. So when we think about relief, then we have two different ways of looking at relief. The first is, absolute relief. And that means that whatever it is that's triggered that stress response, whatever has triggered that nervous system response or filled the bucket, has gone. We can truly relax away from it. And that's a good one for pain. If we're in pain and we get pain relief, then we get absolute relief. And it gives us that opportunity to not have to experience that. If, of course, the pain relief isn't enough and the pain comes back, then we've only managed to get the other one, which is temporary relief. Now, the thing with absolute relief is it's what we all try and get, and it can be very hard to identify what it is for the animal that is the primary cause, the primary stressor for that animal. But it's what we're aiming for all the time, is to try and give that animal absolute relief, to remove the thing that is triggering that stress response. But temporary relief is also valid. So, for example, say if you've had a really bad day at work, you don't enjoy your job very much, and you end up making a nice hot bubble bath and a glass of Prosecco, that is temporary relief, because sadly the next day the job is still stressful, the job is still something you don't enjoy. But that temporary relief is important, and again, when working with the animals and the dogs, we want to try and think, how can we give this animal some temporary relief? How can we remove the stressor enough for that dog to kind of decompress a little bit and to kind of recover a little bit before they have to be exposed to the stressor again. So relief is really important. And this brings us on nicely to Pet Remedy. So Pet Remedy as a product is really important as part of offering some relief during that process. I can just carry on talking about this now. So I think when we think about then everything we've learnt as a little summary before we come on to Pet Remedy fully, we can judge and define a behaviour all we like, and that's what we're very good at. But at some point we have to think about what it is that's triggering that and what the animal's experience is in that. And once we've understood that a little bit more, we can then start offering that animal some relief. Using a nutraceutical like Pet Remedy is really good to have as part of that toolkit, because whilst we're doing the behavioural support work, we can offer some relief to that nervous system. And we can also help to keep a few more doors open. And that's what Pet Remedy is really good at, is offering those options when working with the dog. A lot of nutraceuticals, people feel they can just give the animal and then the animal will be okay. And sometimes that can be the case. I know with my own dog, using Pet Remedy can make a huge difference to him almost instantly. And that may be the case for your dog or dogs that you're involved with in their care. More often, however, though, it is part of a bigger strategy, which could be about management. So trying to kind of manage the environment for the dog so that they're not exposed to things that trigger them. It could be using behavioural modification protocols and therapies, as well as and in conjunction with the Pet Remedy product. So when we understand the emotional needs of animals, when we understand the emotional drive to their behaviour, it puts us in a much better place as caregivers, as those who professionally support caregivers, to be able to try and get best outcomes for the animal. And that's ultimately what we all want. Pet Remedy is a really important part of that process, and it's an important part of any toolkit. If you'd like to know more about the Pet Remedy product, please contact us. We will be doing more of these educational videos in the coming months, both hosted by myself and other people who are leaders in their field, so that we can all help to kind of get the knowledge that we need to be more aware caregivers and to be able to try and get the best outcomes for our animals. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation today. If you have any questions and you want them directed at me, please just email us at info@petremedy.co.uk and I'll always try and get back and answer them for you. Thank you.